The lawman's bargain. The stagecoach rattled into Silver Bend like a dying man's last cough, spewing dust and exhaustion into the dry Arizona air. Elara Vance pressed her face to the grimy window, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line, the beginning of everything. The town was a scar on the face of the desert, a single main street of sun-bleached wood and false fronts, huddled beneath a sky so vast and blue it felt like a judgment. She clutched the letter in her lap, the paper soft and worn from 100 rereadings. I can offer you a home, protection, a life of purpose, it had said. The words now felt like a prayer, or an epitaph. The man waiting on the boardwalk was not what she had pictured. She had imagined someone softer. A shopkeeper, perhaps, or a quiet farmer. The man she saw was carved from the same unforgiving stone as the canyon lands surrounding the town. He stood with a stillness that was unnerving, his shoulders broad beneath a dark, well-worn duster. A U.S. Marshal's star was pinned to his chest, catching the harsh sun. His face was all hard lines and shadow, a jaw clenched tight, and eyes the color of glacial ice that found hers the moment the stagecoach door creaked open. He didn't smile. He simply assessed, his gaze a physical weight that stripped away the layers of her traveling suit and the fragile composure she'd clung to for 500 miles. The driver opened the door, and the desert heat washed over her, thick and suffocating. Elara gathered her skirts, her legs stiff and unsteady. As she descended, the man, Marshal Cade Sullivan, stepped forward. He didn't offer his hand. Elara Vance. His voice was low, graveled, as if he didn't use it often. It wasn't a question. Yes, she managed, her own voice a whisper. I'm Sullivan. Your things? He gestured to the single trunk being unlashed from the roof. It held every remnant of her former life, a life that had ended with her father's debts and a string of broken promises. This is all, she said. He hefted the trunk onto his shoulder as if it were filled with feathers, the muscles in his back and arms coiling with effortless strength. He was even taller up close, his presence so large it seemed to swallow the space around them. My house is this way. He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned and started down the boardwalk. Elara hurried to keep up, her new boots pinching, the dust coating her tongue. People on the street watched them pass. Their eyes held no warmth, only a flat, calculating curiosity. A man with a sneer and a tin star of his own, a deputy, spat a stream of tobacco into the dust as they passed. That her, Cade? Your solution? Sullivan didn't break stride. Mind your business, Riggs. The house was at the end of the street, a sturdy 2-story structure of adobe and timber, set a little apart from the others. It looked more like a fortress than a home, with heavy shutters and a stout door. He unlocked it and pushed it open, standing aside for her to enter. The interior was sparse, clean, and relentlessly masculine. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a few chairs. No curtains, no rugs, no signs of a woman's touch. It was a shelter, not a sanctuary. I know it's not what you're used to from Boston, he said, setting her trunk down by the stairs. But it's secure. There's a bolt on the bedroom door. Elara turned to him, confusion warring with a fresh spike of fear. The bedroom door, Marshal Sullivan, our correspondence. I understood we were to be married. We are, he said, his icy gaze holding hers. When Preacher Miller rides through in 10 days' time. Until then, you'll stay here, with me. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. That is entirely improper. There must be a boarding house. No. The single word was absolute, final. The boarding house isn't safe. This town isn't safe. You're here because I need a wife. A legal, binding connection to this property. But more than that, I need a witness the men in this town can't intimidate or buy. You're an educated woman from back east. Your word will hold weight in a court of law. That's the bargain, Miss Vance. I provide the protection, the home, the name. You provide the credibility. The bluntness of it was a physical blow. The romantic illusions she'd spun from his letters shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. This wasn't a courtship. It was a transaction. A cold, hard business arrangement. You used me, she whispered, her face burning with humiliation. I offered you a way out, he corrected, his voice devoid of apology, and you took it. The terms have just been made clear. Your room is upstairs, first on the right. I'll be down here. He turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the stark silence of his house, the dream of a loving marriage crumbling to dust around her. Before we see how Elara navigates this stark new reality, don't forget to show this story some love. Comment Marshall if you're on Team Cade, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of the tension. The first days were a study in silent coexistence. Elara stayed upstairs, unpacking her meager belongings, while Sullivan moved through the house below like a ghost, his presence announced only by the creak of floorboards and the sound of him cleaning his guns. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles. He left food for her on the table, simple, hearty fare he cooked himself, and expected her to clean the dishes. It was a new kind of loneliness, sharpened by the constant, unnerving awareness of the man just a room away. On the third day, her pride and boredom overcame her fear. She found him at the table, meticulously disassembling a Colt revolver, his hands moving with a practiced, lethal grace. This house is a disgrace, she announced, her voice trembling only slightly. His hand stilled. He didn't look up. It keeps the weather out. It's devoid of any comfort, of any life. I can't live like this. Finally, his ice blue eyes lifted to hers. You can, and you will. This isn't a finishing school, Miss Vance. It's the frontier. Even the frontier deserves a semblance of civilization, she shot back, emboldened by his dismissiveness. I am going to the general store, with or without your permission. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and she felt the full force of his will, a palpable thing in the room. Then, a flicker of something, not approval, perhaps respect for the spark of defiance, crossed his face. I'll accompany you. The trip to the store was a lesson in his standing in Silver Bend. Men touched their hats, their eyes wary. Women glanced away quickly. Deputy Riggs leaned against a post outside the saloon, his smile a venomous thing. Playing escort now, Cade? That's a pretty thing to have to protect. Might draw the wrong kind of attention. Sullivan's hand didn't move toward his gun, but his entire body went still, like a predator sighting prey. You're the only one drawing attention, Riggs. Move along. The sheer, quiet authority in his voice made the deputy's smirk vanish. He slunk away, and Elara felt a shiver that was not entirely fear. There was a raw power in Cade Sullivan, a dangerous magnetism that was as unsettling as it was compelling. At the store, she used the last of her own pin money to buy fabric for curtains, a rug, and a few other small comforts. Sullivan watched her, saying nothing, but he paid for the items without comment and carried them home. That small victory sparked a change. She began to clean, to sew, to impose her will upon the stark environment. She didn't ask for permission, she simply acted. She hung the curtains, placed the rug by the fireplace, and started a small herb garden in a crate by the window. He watched her efforts with silent, guarded curiosity, but he didn't stop her. One evening, she was struggling to light the stubborn cook stove when his shadow fell over her. You're flooding it, he said, his voice close to her ear. She jumped, but he simply reached around her, his large, capable hands adjusting the flue and striker. A moment later, a clean flame caught. He didn't move back immediately. She was acutely aware of the heat of his body, the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. Her breath hitched. Thank you, she whispered. He stepped away as if burned. Supper won't cook itself. The tension between them was shifting, transforming from a simple Cold War into something more complex, more electric. It was a tension that simmered under the surface of their every interaction. The turning point came a week after her arrival. A commotion from the street, shouts, the sound of breaking glass, had Sullivan on his feet in an instant, his hand on his gun. Stay inside. Bolt the door. He was gone before she could argue. Peering through the new curtains, she saw a chaotic scene. 2 drunken cowboys brawling, a small crowd egging them on. Sullivan moved into the fray with a terrifying economy of motion. He didn't shout, didn't brawl. He simply ended it. One man found himself disarmed and on the ground with an arm twisted behind his back. The other, swinging a bottle, was met with a single, brutal punch that dropped him like a stone. It was swift, efficient, and utterly ruthless. Elara should have been horrified. But as she watched him stand there, breathing steadily amidst the sudden silence, his gaze sweeping the crowd and daring anyone else to move, she felt a hot, unexpected thrill. This was not the civilized world of Boston. This was a world of hard men and harder truths, and the man protecting her was the hardest of them all. When he returned, a thin line of blood was trickling from a cut on his knuckle. Without a word, Elara fetched a bowl of water and a clean cloth. She gestured for him to sit. "I can do that," he said, his voice rough. "I know you can," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. She took his hand. It was large, scarred, the skin calloused and rough. She cleaned the cut gently, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the contact. She could feel the strength in that hand, the capacity for violence, but held in her own, it was still. He watched her, his intense gaze a physical weight on her bowed head. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken acknowledgement. "You were very efficient out there," she said, not looking up. "It's the only language some men understand." She finished tying the small bandage and made to pull her hand away, but his fingers closed around hers, holding her there. His grip wasn't harsh, but it was unbreakable. Her eyes flew to his. "I'm not a good man, Elara," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've done things that would give you nightmares. This star doesn't make me a hero. It makes me a weapon. That's what you're marrying, a weapon. A man who knows how to break things, to end things. Not a man who knows how to build this." He gestured vaguely at the curtains, the rug, the home she was trying to make. She didn't pull away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Perhaps a weapon is what's needed to build something in a place like this," she whispered. "And perhaps you know more about building than you think." His eyes searched hers, the ice in them seeming to fracture, revealing a glimpse of something raw and turbulent beneath. He lifted his other hand and slowly, so slowly, traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. The touch was searing, sending a jolt of pure lightning through her system. It was the first truly gentle contact they had ever shared. "Perhaps," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He released her hand and stood, the moment broken. But the air between them was forever changed. The cold bargain had developed a crack, and through it, a dangerous and undeniable heat was beginning to seep. The story is heating up, isn't it? Let me know in the comments what you think Elara should do next. And if you're loving the slow burn, make sure you subscribe for the wedding we've all been waiting for. The next 2 days were a delicate dance. The air in the house was thick with everything left unsaid. His eyes followed her now, not with cold assessment, but with a simmering, focused intensity that made her skin feel too tight. He started leaving small things for her. A wildflower in a jar on the table, a book of poetry he must have dug out from some forgotten crate. They were awkward, tentative offerings, but they meant more to her than any flowery word from his letters. The night before the preacher was due, a fierce desert storm broke over Silver Bend. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters and driving rain against the windows. Elara was in her room when a particularly violent gust of wind blew her door open with a crash. She gasped, clutching her shawl around her nightdress. Sullivan was at her door in an instant, his silhouette filling the frame. "Are you all right?" "Yes, it was just the wind," she said, her voice shaky. He stepped inside to secure the latch, his presence making the room feel suddenly small. The only light came from a single lamp, casting flickering shadows across the sharp planes of his face. Another peal of thunder shook the house, and Elara flinched. He didn't leave. He stood there watching her, the storm raging both outside and within the small space between them. "Elara," he said, her name a rough caress on his tongue. And then he was crossing the room. He didn't kiss her. He simply framed her face with his hands, his touch devastatingly gentle despite its strength. He looked into her eyes, his own a turbulent sea of conflict and desire. "I'm not going to be a gentle husband," he warned, his voice raw. "I'm possessive. I'm ruthless when it comes to what's mine, and from the moment you say I do, you will be mine, in every way. There will be no going back. Do you understand the bargain now?" Her fear was a distant echo, drowned out by the roaring in her blood. This was no longer about a legal arrangement. This was about a primal claim, and she found, to her shock, that she wanted to be claimed. "I understand," she breathed. He lowered his head, his lips a hair's breadth from hers. "Say it." "I am yours," she whispered. The words were a trigger. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his mouth captured hers. It was not a kiss of gentle seduction. It was a claiming. It was hard and hungry and desperate, a torrent of pent-up need that swept her away. His arms banded around her, crushing her to the solid wall of his chest. She should have been frightened, but all she felt was a rightness, a final, dizzying click, as a piece of her soul she never knew was missing slotted into place. She kissed him back with a fervor that matched his own, her hands tangling in his dark, rain-damp hair. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing as if they'd run for miles. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Tomorrow," he vowed, his voice thick with promise, "I will make you my wife. And tomorrow night, I will finish what we started here." He left her then, returning to the storm downstairs. Elara sank onto her bed, her fingers pressed to her swollen lips, her body humming with a strange, new, and terrifying power. The bargain was sealed not with a signature, but with a kiss. The wedding the next day was a simple, hurried affair in his front room, the traveling preacher dusting desert sand from his Bible. Elara wore her best dress, the blue one. Sullivan stood beside her, a solid, immovable presence in a clean black coat, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her vows come out as a trembling whisper. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, he didn't wait for permission. He cupped her face and kissed her, a hard, possessive stamp of ownership that left no doubt in anyone's mind, least of all hers. The well-wishers, few as they were, drifted away. The preacher left, and they were alone, husband and wife. Sullivan locked the door and turned to her. The civilized veneer of the ceremony had vanished, replaced by the raw, untamed man from the night before. His eyes were dark, with a hunger that made her stomach clench, with a mixture of fear and sharp, aching desire. "The wait is over," he said, his voice a low thrum that vibrated deep within her. He didn't carry her. He simply took her hand and led her upstairs, his grip firm and unyielding. In their bedroom, the storm of the night before was replaced by a new, more intimate tempest. He turned her, his fingers making quick work of the buttons on her dress. The fabric pooled at her feet, leaving her in only her thin chemise and drawers. The cool air raised goosebumps on her skin, but the heat of his gaze burned them away. "Beautiful," he growled, the word full of awe and possession. He stripped off his own clothes with ruthless efficiency, and her breath caught. He was magnificent, all corded muscle and scarred skin, a testament to a life of violence, and he was fully, powerfully aroused. He laid her back on the bed, coming down over her, caging her with his body. His mouth found hers again, but this kiss was different, slower, deeper, a deliberate exploration. His hands followed, learning the shape of her, cupping the weight of her breasts through the linen, his thumb stroking her nipples until they pebbled into aching points. She arched against him, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Tell me what you want, Elara," he commanded against her skin, his mouth tracing a hot path down her neck. "You!" she gasped, her hands sliding over the hard planes of his back. "I want you." He made a sound of pure male satisfaction. He peeled away the last of her clothing, his eyes drinking in the sight of her, naked and trembling beneath him. He touched her everywhere, his calloused hands, surprisingly tender as they mapped her curves, the dip of her waist, the swell of her hips. When his fingers finally stroked through the soft curls at the junction of her thighs, she jolted. "Shh," he soothed, his voice rough. "This is mine too. All of you is mine." He parted her folds, finding the slick, sensitive core of her. She cried out as he circled the bundle of nerves with a relentless, knowing touch, building a fire in her belly that threatened to consume her. "Cade," she begged, not even knowing what she was begging for. "When I take you," he whispered, his breath hot in her ear, "it will be for life. There is no one else for you. Ever. Do you understand?" "Yes," she sobbed, her body writhing under his expert ministrations. He positioned himself at her entrance, the broad head of him pressing against her wet heat. He held her gaze, his own fierce with a possessiveness that should have terrified her, but instead it set her soul on fire. "Look at me," he ordered. She did. And as he pushed forward, as he filled her in one slow, inexorable thrust, breaking through the final barrier, she kept her eyes locked on his. There was a sharp, burning pain, and she gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders. He held still, buried deep inside her, his body trembling with the effort of his restraint. "Breathe, my wife," he murmured, brushing the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "Just breathe. The pain will pass." And it did, fading into a feeling of incredible fullness, of being stretched and claimed in the most fundamental way possible. He began to move, slow, deep thrusts that rubbed a spot inside her she never knew existed. The pleasure began to build again, sharper, more intense than before, coiling tight in her core. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice guttural. "Come for me, Elara. Let me feel you." The coil snapped. Her world fractured into a million points of blinding light as her body convulsed around his, a raw, guttural cry torn from her throat. Her climax triggered his own. With a final deep thrust and a ragged groan of her name, he spilled his seed inside her, his big body shuddering with the force of his release. He collapsed atop her, his weight a comforting anchor in the swirling aftermath. For a long time, they lay there, tangled together, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Finally, he shifted, rolling to his side and taking her with him, keeping them joined. He brushed the damp hair from her forehead, his gaze softer now, but no less intense. "The bargain is complete," he said quietly. Elara looked up at the face of her husband, the hard, dangerous, beautiful man who was hers. She traced the line of his jaw. "No," she whispered, a slow smile touching her lips. "I think it's only just beginning." And as he kissed her again, slow and deep and full of a promise that stretched into forever, Elara Vance knew that in this hard land, with this hard man, she had not just found a bargain. She had found her destiny. The dawn after the storm of their wedding night broke clear and brilliant, washing the adobe walls in pale gold. Elara woke to the solid weight of Cade's arm draped over her waist, his chest a warm, steady wall against her back. For a moment, she simply lay there, absorbing the reality of it. The bargain had been sealed in flesh and fire, and the world had not ended. It had begun. He stirred behind her, his hand splaying possessively across her stomach. "You're awake." His voice was a sleep-roughened rumble against her ear. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She turned in his embrace to face him. In the soft morning light, the harsh lines of his face were relaxed. The glacial ice in his eyes warmed to a quiet, startling intensity as he looked at her. He didn't smile, but the way his gaze traced her features was a language all its own. "Are you—" He hesitated, a rare flicker of uncertainty in the man who never seemed to doubt anything. "I'm well," she assured him, her cheeks warming. "More than well." That seemed to satisfy him. His expression shifted back to its familiar determination. "Good. The work doesn't stop for a wedding." He rose from the bed, a powerful, unself-conscious silhouette against the window, and began to dress. The intimacy of the night was giving way to the practicality of the day, but the connection hummed between them, a new, unbreakable thread. The change in their dynamic was immediate and profound. Where before there had been a guarded silence, now there was a quiet understanding. He no longer just left food for her. He waited for her to join him, his gaze lingering on her as she moved about their kitchen. Their kitchen. He started telling her things, not just orders, but information. He pointed out the window to a distant mesa. The Crenshaw gang was last spotted near there. If they ride into my town, there will be trouble. Our town, she corrected softly, placing a plate before him. His eyes met hers, and he gave a slow, single nod. Our town. She began to accompany him on his rounds, not as a sheltered burden, but as his partner. The townsfolk, who had watched her with curiosity or pity, now looked at her with a new kind of respect. She was no longer just the marshal's mail-order bride. She was Sullivan's woman. She saw how his presence calmed disputes before they started, how a single look from him could silence a rowdy saloon. She was learning the map of his power, and she was becoming a part of it. One afternoon, a well-dressed man from the Territorial Bank arrived, his demeanor slick and condescending. He spread papers on their table, speaking of liens and obligations on properties throughout Silver Bend, including the one their house stood on. The previous owner had certain debts, you see, the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. The bank is prepared to be reasonable, Marshal, but we must have a resolution. Cade's expression was granite, a storm brewing in his eyes. But before he could speak, Elara stepped forward. She picked up one of the documents, her eyes, trained in the ledgers of her father's failed business, scanning the figures. This interest calculation is usurious, sir, she said, her voice cool and clear. And this clause regarding transfer of ownership upon default is invalid under the Arizona Territorial Code of 1864, Section 12. My father was a lawyer. I may have been his secretary, but I learned enough to recognize a predatory contract. She set the paper down, meeting the banker's startled gaze without flinching. I suggest you take these back to your superiors and have them reviewed for legality. My husband and I will not be intimidated. And the silence in the room was absolute. The banker's face flushed. Cade had not moved, but Elara could feel the shift in him, a wave of fierce, proud astonishment. The banker gathered his papers with mumbled excuses and fled. When the door closed, Cade turned to her. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, soul-deep recognition. You, he said, his voice thick with emotion, are a constant surprise. That night, their lovemaking was different. It was slower, more deliberate, a deep, worshipful exploration. He took his time, his hands and mouth mapping her body as if committing it to memory, his whispers against her skin speaking of pride and a devotion that went far beyond their initial bargain. When they finally joined, it was with a shocking tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. This was not just possession, it was partnership. The true test came a week later. Deputy Riggs, his resentment festering, confronted Cade in the street, drunk and belligerent. You think you own this town, Sullivan? You and your high and mighty eastern whore? Cade went still, the kind of deadly stillness Elara now understood. You're relieved of your duty, Riggs. Get out of my town. Riggs went for his gun. It was over in a heartbeat. Cade's draw was a blur of motion. A single shot echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. Riggs screamed, clutching his bloody hand, his pistol spinning in the dust. Cade stood over him, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt. I said get out. The next shot won't miss. As Riggs scrambled away, sobbing, Cade's eyes found Elara's, where she stood on the boardwalk, her hand pressed to her mouth. He holstered his gun and walked toward her, the crowd parting before him. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his gaze searching her face, perhaps looking for fear, for revulsion. Elara descended the steps until she stood before him. She reached out, not to his face, but to the hand that had just fired the shot. She took it, lacing her fingers through his. feeling the residual warmth of the gunmetal, the steady strength that had just defended her honor and his own. "Let's go home, Cade," she said quietly. The last of the ice in his eyes melted away. He squeezed her hand, and together they turned their backs on the staring crowd and walked toward the house that was no longer just his fortress, but their shared sanctuary. The bargain was forgotten, replaced by a bond forged in trust, tested by fire, and sealed by a love that was as unyielding and enduring as the desert itself.